Hello everyone, Professor Philip Travis. This week in American History Part 2, we're going to be examining the Progressive Era. Before I begin talking a little bit about this period of time in American history, I just want to remind you really quick, of course, be sure to check in on the readings and assignments page in your content area for the week so you have a clear understanding of what we are looking at in terms of assignments this week. So the Progressive Era, we were just covering the Gilded Age, that period of time that was coined by Mark Twain, which of course, Mark Twain referred to this effectively as a period of time with this shiny, incredible outside appearance, and of course shiny on the outside because tremendous wealth, tremendous innovation, a record numbers of patents, the period where Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone, Thomas Edison and the light bulb, the electrifications of cities, the building of amazing engineering feats like the Brooklyn Bridge, among other things. The period of time in which the United States grew to become the world's leader in things like steel production, which on the outside looked fantastic, but of course, as Mark Twain was sort of getting at in that characterization, underneath the gilded surface, underneath the shiny surface, was something a little bit more crude, and that would be a reference to the deep level of wealth inequality in the United States, political corruption, 2/3 of a city like New York, 2/3 of its population living in slums, in tenement houses that were absolutely terrible in terms of their conditions. A period of time in which there was effectively no public education system like we know today, a time period in which maybe 2% of the population would attend college, a time period in which, yes, while there were incredible stories like Andrew Carnegie's story of, or Thomas Edison for that matter, of them making themselves, from sort of the most humble beginnings, the reality is that during the Gilded Age, for the vast majority of Americans, the American dream was really not very accessible, if accessible at all. The Progressive Era is the reaction to that. If we think about the reaction to the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era, if we think about where does the country go in the 20th century, now historians have suggested, some of them, that the 21st century very well might be witnessing a sort of second Gilded Age. But for the 20th century, the United States really in a moderate way revolted from the extremes of an unregulated industrial capitalism that embodied the Gilded Age. It revolted from that, creating a more moderate middle path during the 20th century. And that was really first embodied by the Progressive Era, in which leaders, and as you see here, you see Theodore Roosevelt, and here you see, these are political cartoons from the era, of course, and here you see President Woodrow Wilson. Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican president, from 1901 to 1909, and Woodrow Wilson, of course, the Democrat president, who was served from 1913 to 1921, two of the three progressive presidents. The Progressive Era was an era of reform in the United States, in which particularly reformers sought to tackle a myriad of issues. And it must be noted that while I have political cartoons of presidents up here, that in a lot of respects the Progressive Era was really driven by grassroots activism, the activism of women activists who pushed not only for things like the right to vote, but for fair labor practices, for worker safety, for an end of child labor, educational improvements, and so on. There were, of course, African-American activists like W.E.B. Du Bois, who helped to found the NAACP. There were workers' activists, union workers' rights activists, and socialist leaders like Eugene V. Debs, even though most progressives would not have defined themselves as socialist per se. When we look at the presidency during the Progressive Era, the focal point of some of our reform-minded politicians and presidents, and it wasn't just presidents, there were also really important political leaders at the state level, like Wisconsin's Fighting Bob La Follette, as he was referred to. But the focus of presidential politics, of sort of national politics, when it came to reforming the extremes of corruption and power and wealth inequality from the Gilded Age, really focused on things like monopolies or trusts, wealth and power in politics. They focused on trying to give small businesses, consumers, and workers sort of greater rights, a greater role in the country, in the economy, and likewise in the pursuit of the American dream. Many of them were environmental conservationists, as we see certainly with Theodore Roosevelt, with the massive amounts of acreage of forest land that he conserved for recreation and for sustainable resource use by the country. These political cartoons you see here demonstrate the trust-busting activity, the sort of battle between political leaders in the country who have the best interests of the country at heart and the sort of vested interests of major business, banking, corporate power in the United States. Here you see Theodore Roosevelt in this political cartoon battling the railroad trust. And of course, in the beginning of Roosevelt's presidency, he assumed his office, of course, after the tragic assassination of President William McKinley at the beginning of McKinley's first term, or second term, the first year of his second term as president. In 1902, Theodore Roosevelt would use antitrust powers originally created in the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. He would use the antitrust sort of powers of the federal government to prevent the merger of a major railroad merger, particularly involving the banker, powerful American, the same individual who loaned the United States money during the Depression of 1894 to prevent the country from going bankrupt, J.P. Morgan. And Roosevelt, of course, argued that trust monopolies were fundamentally hurtful to middle class and consuming Americans and farmers, particularly because of their ability to charge whatever they would like for the use of their services, and doing so in a manner that was very biased towards friends and negatively biased against those that might be their opponents, like farmers, for example. Roosevelt argued that this was bad for Americans, and the Northern Securities Trust, which he prevented this merger, and it became really the epitome of Roosevelt's trust-busting activity. And you see this kind of depicted here, an incredible fight between J.P. Morgan and Theodore Roosevelt that Roosevelt and the United States would triumph in, as the Supreme Court would ultimately uphold the prevention of the Northern Securities Railroad Trust merger. And here you see a political cartoon of Woodrow Wilson battling what Wilson, the Democrat, and the last of the three progressive presidents, called the triple wall of privilege. And here you see privilege, tariff, trust. The tariff was often a concern of progressives because during the Gilded Age, a high tariff, which was consistently high during the Gilded Age, meant that large corporations and trusts had no competition. They were able to become bigger and bigger and more powerful and earn more and more profits without any competition, basically refuting one of the most basic principles of capitalism. So progressives wanted to lower the tariff. And when Wilson was president, his administration did just that, lowering the tariff with the Underwood tariff, the passage of the Underwood tariff. A lower tariff would mean greater competition. It would mean that trusts would be forced to be competitive and to lower prices for consumers. Woodrow Wilson also expanded the list of trusts that were considered illegal, particularly with the passage of the Clayton Antitrust Act. The Clayton Antitrust Act, labor leader Samuel Gompers referred to as the Magna Carta for labor, because it, for the first time, formally removed workers' unions from the list of illegal trusts. During the Gilded Age, there were many, many impediments to workers forming a union. collectively bargaining for better wages. And one of the ways that that lawyers of your corporate trusts would try to prevent this was to argue that they were in fact forming an illegal trust. They were monopolizing labor. Well, now the Clayton Antitrust Act formally removed labor from that list. And in so doing, this was one step towards the federal government really formally saying that unions are legal, and effectively it should be the right of American workers to do this if they choose to do this. And you really see that happen during the New Deal of the 1930s, in Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, when you really see a lot of the progressive ideas become even more grand and significant in the 20th century. And the last one, of course, of the triple wall of privilege was the banks, which you call it the three T's. The bank doesn't really count, in my opinion, because the shouldn't count as a T. But nonetheless, that's what they called it. The banks. Banks during, as I mentioned, J.P. Morgan's bank had actually bailed the federal government out during the Depression of 1893 and 94 because the country was actually on the verge of bankruptcy during that Depression. During the 19th century, the 1800s, the federal government really had no ability to, in a meaningful sense, regulate the economy or the currency in the country. There were no federal protections, and there won't really be major federal protections until you get to the New Deal of the 1930s, at least on people's personal savings. But the federal government in times of crisis, as well as American consumers, were really at the will of bankers. The government could not encourage banks to increase the monetary supply. When banks went out of business, people lost everything. There were bank runs constantly during the 19th century. Of course, you'll see that again on the eve of the Great Depression. But one of the ways that one of the ways that Wilson sought to begin to reform and address this is still in place today, and that was the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve Act, which creates the U.S. Federal Reserve and creates reserve banks throughout the country, where you have now private banks that are kind of in collaboration with the federal government. And this gives the federal government a much, much greater ability to play a role in working the economy and manipulating the currency when it is necessary, ideally in the best interest of the consumers. And this was a huge step in positive reform for everyday Americans, because before, in the 19th century, the country was really at the will of bankers, and the large banking entities in the United States during the Gilded Age really held a great deal of power over the federal government and the consumers and the middle class, simply because of their ability to control exclusively the currency in the country. And so the Federal Reserve Act, creating the Federal Reserve System, which of course you see on all of your paper currency today, still in place today, was done to help the federal government have a greater role in regulating the economy and the currency in the United States. So Woodrow Wilson and the triple wall of privilege, Franklin Roosevelt trust busting with Northern Securities, just a few of the progressive reforms that these presidents championed during their terms in office. So we're going to be looking at this week, and we'll be talking a lot about the grassroots activists as well that were really champions of the progressive period as well, as the country moves away from the extremes of a laissez-faire, unregulated industrial capitalism and towards more of a moderate middle path moving into the 20th century.